283 days ago, witnesses last saw the British warship Voyager. This is 1742. Back home in England, the ship Voyager and its crew had long been considered dead. The ship was traversing one of the most difficult sea routes on a secret military mission. Who knows, perhaps it was captured by the enemy, perhaps dangerous currents or a strong storm did their work. More than 200 sailors disappeared, and no one expected them home anymore. However, 283 days after the ship's disappearance, residents of a small Brazilian town looked in amazement at the white newcomers on the shore. 30 people crawled out of a makeshift broken boat. Each one resembled a walking skeleton wrapped in a thin layer of skin. These were the sailors of the missing Voyager. They were immediately elevated to hero status. Stories about their shipwreck, miraculous survival on an uninhabited island, and heroic voyage on a makeshift boat were printed in newspapers like a serial. An important element of a good serial is an unexpected twist. And the drama titled The Wreck of the Voyager contained one of the most incredible twists in history. 6 months after the sailors returned home, it turned out that they were not heroes. They were mutineers, murderers, and, according to some reports, cannibals. On one hand, the disappearance of the Voyager is an amazing story of survival, shipwreck, miraculous rescue, struggle with hunger, diseases, and the elements. But at the same time, the story of the Voyager is much more. It includes a chase for treasures, sea battles, triumph, and finally, a mystery lasting several centuries. Water filled the ship's hull. Captain David Cheap watched as his vessel, the first warship under his command, perished. Cheap could barely stand on his feet. He was tormented by scurvy and a dislocated shoulder. Inside the ship, torn hammocks, hull fragments, and numerous wooden chests floated in the water. The ship Centurion stood in the dock in the British port of Portsmouth. The massive warship and its crew were preparing to set sail. Each sailor took a wooden chest with personal belongings on the long voyage, leaving behind the heavy burden of their past. Lieutenant David Cheap was no exception. His noble Scottish origin gave him nothing but status. Cheap's father, after his death, left a small fortune, a bit of land, and quite a few children. One of the younger sons, David, could not count on a substantial inheritance. At 17, he went to serve in the Navy. Naval affairs could theoretically lead a young man to money and fame. After 25 years of career, David Cheap had neither. At sea, he mainly engaged in monotonous patrolling of company ships. On land, creditors constantly pursued him. And despite years of searching for a wife, David was still single. However, Cheap's position was not hopeless. As a lieutenant, he held the position of deputy captain on the large ship Centurion. And on the professional horizon, a unique opportunity was emerging. It's hard to imagine a more effective career engine for an officer than war. Britain had just gotten involved in a battle against the mighty Spain. The two empires were once again going to divide a significant part of the world between themselves. Those who control the sea control trade. Those who control trade control the world's wealth. Once formulated by a British statesman, Spain historically dominated in Latin America. Britain was going to compete with it in the region. In practice, this struggle meant the seizure and appropriation of others' natural resources, slave trade, as well as the subjugation or complete extermination of local peoples. At the same time, both empires did not forget to justify their material interests with the noble mission of spreading civilization to remote points of the planet. British authorities were preparing a plan for a major attack on Spanish territories in the Caribbean. The global operation involved nearly 200 ships. Part of the plan was a small secret mission of 5 British warships. They were to round South America and destroy Spanish ships in the Pacific Ocean that were trading with Asia. The main target of this secret mission was the Spanish galleon. A couple of times a year, loaded with gold and silver, it shuttled from Mexico to the Philippines to purchase goods in Asia. Capturing the vessel promised the British the biggest haul in history. The commander of the secret squadron of 5 ships was appointed George Anson, captain of the ship Centurion. For his deputy, Lieutenant David Cheap, this was double luck. Firstly, upon capturing an enemy ship loaded with treasures, the entire crew received a substantial reward. This would solve all the lieutenant's financial problems. Secondly, the mission opened a real chance for Cheap to become captain. He had long been Anson's right hand, appointed as squadron commander. It was quite possible that Cheap would be entrusted with commanding one of the ships participating in the secret mission. Thus, he would get what he had hoped for when he joined the Navy at 17. Recognition and money. David Cheap was eager to set sail. However, months passed and Centurion and the other squadron ships still stood in the docks. In times when ships were made of wood, their main enemies were not the enemy's cannons at all. Harsh sea waters, termites, fungus, rats, and a special type of woodworm that grew up to 30 centimeters. All this quite quickly destroyed the high-tech vessel for its time. After each voyage, the huge ship practically had to be rebuilt anew. All these problems also concerned one of the 5 squadron ships named Voyager. Initially, the 37-meter Voyager was a trading vessel of the East India Company. Needing additional ships amid the war with Spain, British authorities bought the trading vessel to turn it into a combat one. The voyage on the Voyager was to include 250 people. On the main squadron ship Centurion, twice as many. However, none of the 5 ships participating in the secret mission could complete their crews. In the British Navy of that time, there was no conscription, and in wartime conditions, there were not enough volunteers. Moreover, many of those already recruited ended up in the hospital. They suffered from headaches, body aches, fever, diarrhea, and nausea, symptoms of ship fever, today known as typhus. Then, no one understood the nature of this bacterial disease, which was spread by lice and other parasites. Unwashed sailors in large numbers in confined spaces were an excellent environment for spread. Desperate to recruit enough volunteers, the Admiralty resorted to extreme measures. Raids began. They grabbed anyone who somehow resembled a person with fleet experience. This could be revealed by a particular clothing element or traces of tar under the nails, which on ships of that time covered practically everything for water protection. And even these measures proved insufficient. To complete the 5 ships of the squadron, the Admiralty had to allocate 140 Marines who had no fleet experience, meaning they were almost useless. But even more questions were raised by the 500 veterans found in old folks' homes. Many of them were 50, 60, 70 years old. Some suffered from rheumatism, some had hearing or vision problems, some lacked limbs. Captain Anson and his deputy Cheap were, of course, not thrilled with the crew composition. However, the 2,000 people on the 5 squadron ships were finally completed, and in September 1740, after almost a year of delay, the squadron set sail. Voyager was named after a not very famous British captain from the past. However, it was not only a surname but also a word. In English, wager means to make bets, which is extremely symbolic considering the future fate of the ship. In September 1740, none of the crew suspected that by setting sail, they were making the biggest bet on their own lives. On the lowest deck of the Voyager, no sunlight penetrated. In the semi-darkness, dozens of fabric bags hung from the ceiling, resembling cocoons. In these hammocks slept the lower-rank sailors. In one of the bags lay John Byron. He occupied a place on the lowest deck despite his junior officer rank. Byron was only 16. As the offspring of an aristocratic family, he could potentially become a ship captain and even an admiral. But for that, long training was required. The first 6 years on the ship, a novice officer performed the hard work of a lower-rank sailor. This best allowed learning how the ship functions from the inside. John Byron's lineage was full of lords and barons. For that level of aristocracy, service in the Navy was not considered the most suitable choice. However, the teenager Byron, impressed by books about seafarers, decided it was his calling. On board the Voyager, the young aristocrat's romantic expectations collided with harsh reality. Dirty decks, dressed like a ragamuffin sailor, constant stench, and rats. In his diary, Byron recorded that one of the first days, impressed by what he saw, he took off his neckerchief, covered his eyes with it, and cried. The Voyager, like other British warships of the 18th century, resembled society in miniature. There, one could meet people from all social strata, starting from the inhabitants of the urban bottom, ending with officers who had noble origins. The ages of the Voyager's crew members demonstrated an even greater gap. Several boys were barely over 10. They were just learning the sailor's trade. The oldest was the 80-year-old ship's cook. Thus, the ship ended up with hundreds of crew members of different ages, different origins, with different experiences and characters. But they all had to spend several years of voyage in confined space. The glue that connected absolutely incompatible men into one team was discipline, so its violation was harshly punished. The ship captain during the voyage had more rights than the king. Unlike the latter, the captain could order a sailor to be flogged. There was also a court-martial, and for one or another violation, after the voyage's end, a crew member could be sentenced to prison or even death. The first month of the squadron's voyage passed calmly. The ship's crews engaged in routine tasks. Discipline on the ships was in order. The number of typhus cases was non-critical, and provisions were more than sufficient. Back in England, each ship was loaded with a whole farm of animals: pigs, chickens, and sheep. During the voyage, they all made loud noises, indicating that the sea journey was not to their liking. The main problem for the squadron captain Anson was the schedule. Due to unfavorable wind, the ships covered a distance 3 times less than calculated. Therefore, after a short stop on the island of Madeira, the squadron set course for the shores of South America. Britain was already at war with Spain. Several sailors on the squadron ships scanned the ocean surface around the clock for potential enemy ships. However, this did not completely exclude the prospect of a military clash, and the British needed to prepare for such an outcome. By the captain's order, the squadron ships conducted drills to check the condition of the guns and the crew's actions in battle. For firing, each gun required at least 6 sailors. An 8-kilogram cannonball flew out at a speed of 360 meters per second, and the recoil immediately threw the massive gun back. If at that moment a sailor did not manage to step aside, he was doomed. Unlike on land, where guns stood motionless, the ship was in constant motion due to waves, currents, and wind. Thus, accurate shooting became a true art. Gunners were respected on the ship. These were experienced sailors who had passed the corresponding exam. John Bulkeley had served in the Navy for more than 10 years. He started from the lowest positions and rose to gunner. Many Voyager sailors noted his discipline and leadership qualities. In a parallel universe, John Bulkeley could probably have become a captain, but since he could not boast noble origins, the path to leadership positions on the ship was almost certainly closed to him. Unlike Captain Anson, Lieutenant Cheap, and Midshipman Byron, the non-aristocrat Bulkeley could not afford to commission a portrait from a good artist. We cannot say what he looked like. No verbal descriptions have survived. We can only imagine a stereotypical portrait of an Englishman in his middle years who earned his living through difficult and dangerous physical labor. However, despite the lack of external data, we have a fairly good idea of Bulkeley's inner world. He was very religious and took a religious book with him on the voyage. In addition, John made notes. He was not an officer and was not required to keep a detailed ship's log, but he did. Daily, the gunner recorded details of the Voyager's and squadron's voyage. John Bulkeley's notes would later become one of the most important sources about the ship's tragedy. After the squadron crew crossed the Atlantic, they stopped on a small island off the coast of Brazil. There, the sailors replenished supplies and carried out necessary ship repairs. The squadron crew prepared to pass the most dangerous stage of their journey, the waters around Cape Horn. This cape is at the southernmost point of the South American continent. Nearby are the raging waters of the Drake Passage. Due to a whole range of natural conditions, the place is still considered one of the most dangerous waters for navigation. By the mid-18th century, only a few British ships had successfully passed this route. Unofficially, the Drake Passage was called the Graveyard of Ships. What seriously worsened the squadron's position was the spreading typhus epidemic. For months after the start of the voyage, the picture already looked frightening. Crossing the Atlantic, they lost nearly 200 sailors. Essentially, every 10th squadron member died. And this was just the beginning of the mission. Burials at sea were a whole ceremony. The deceased was placed in the hammock in which he slept. A cannonball was placed inside for weight, and the edges were sewn. One of the last stitches was made right through the victim's nose to ensure the person was definitely dead. Then the entire crew gathered on the upper deck. Sailors removed their headgear, and the bag with the sewn corpse was thrown into the water. One of the typhus victims was the captain of the ship Voyager. The squadron commander Anson appointed his longtime deputy, Lieutenant David Cheap, to the vacated position. Thus, Cheap achieved one of his goals. He became the captain of a warship. What perhaps spoiled Cheap's mood at that moment were the dying words of the deceased Voyager captain. Before his very end, he said that this expedition would end in poverty, hunger, death, and destruction. The schedule was critical for the squadron. It was considered that the best time to pass the Drake Passage was summer in the southern hemisphere. From December to February, currents and storms were still very dangerous, but slightly less so than the rest of the year. The British approached the Drake Passage only at the beginning of March, and then one storm after another began. Hurricane winds near Cape Horn could exceed 300 kilometers per hour. Waves rose up to 10 m. Masts broke, sails tore. The Voyager and other ships practically dived underwater before soaring up again. Bulkeley wrote that everything he saw behind him was a giant wave. Everything he saw in front of him was another giant wave. Sailors tied themselves to a reliable surface with a rope so as not to be washed into the water. Initially, the ship's crew was divided into two groups. One relieved the other for the ship's functioning. However, by the end of March, so few able-bodied sailors remained that they were on duty almost without break, guiding the ship through the difficult waters of the Drake Passage. The culprit now was scurvy. In those times, it was the most common cause of death among sailors. Scurvy killed more sailors than storms, enemy cannons, other diseases, and all other causes combined. Sailors' limbs swelled, the whole body ached, the skin acquired a blue tint. Most of the sick were so exhausted that they could not even get out of their hammock. Captain Anson wrote in his journal that this was the strongest outbreak of scurvy in his memory. On the main squadron ship Centurion, about half the crew survived from the initial 500 people. On the Voyager, the situation was significantly better, but there too, every fifth died. No one conducted burial ceremonies anymore. No one had the strength. Sailors simply threw the corpses into the water. The squadron ships were close to facing a shortage of people to operate the vessel. Even most of those who could get out of their hammock moved around the deck like zombies. Ship doctors could do nothing. Scurvy had been known for a long time, but in 1741, no one knew the cause of the disease or an effective treatment method. And the answer was extremely simple. Scurvy was caused by an acute deficiency of vitamin C. The sailors' diet almost completely lacked fresh vegetables and fruits. 7 months had passed since the squadron's departure from England, only 4 weeks since they entered the Drake Passage. Then one of the ship chaplains wrote that the crew was in a state of complete decay, and the only chance for salvation was to finally round the southern part of South America and reach the first inhabited island off the coast of Chile. However, this was hindered, among other things, by navigation features. The modern system for determining longitude did not yet exist, so the captain and crew did not always accurately know where they were. For this reason, even familiar waters, even in good weather, became dangerous. The ship could easily run into coastal rocks and wreck. Not to mention the difficult waters of the Drake Passage. In storm conditions and poor visibility, the squadron ships could separate and lose each other. Even before the start of the passage through the passage, Captain Anson gave instructions for this case. Ships were to reach the coast of Chile and wait for each other at a certain point for 2 months, after which continue the expedition. By mid-April, a couple of ships had fallen behind the squadron. Many sailors on the remaining vessels thought that their colleagues, exhausted by storms and diseases, simply turned back. The remaining squadron ships tried to stay together. Despite the difficult conditions, they lit lamps on the decks and fired shots every half hour. However, despite this, within a week, the Voyager sailors lost sight of all the other ships. On April 19th, Gunner Bulkeley recorded in his journal that he last noticed the lights of the main squadron ship Centurion, after which they dissolved into the darkness. The Voyager was left alone. This meant that if they wrecked, no one would come to their aid. At best, they would spend the rest of their days on a godforsaken, uninhabited island. David Cheap commanded his first warship. He intended to reach the meeting point with the squadron ships in Chile and complete the mission, no matter the cost. Whether the exhausted crew and the storm-battered ship were capable of this was another question. Gunner Bulkeley believed Cheap was wrong. In his opinion, the Voyager in that state had no chance to arrive on time at the shores of Chile. Moreover, Bulkeley believed the ship's course was incorrect, causing them to go too close to the shore, risking running into rocks. Almost a month had passed since the Voyager was left alone. According to Cheap's calculations, the ship was heading north, parallel to Chilean territory at a safe distance from the shore. On May 13th, one of the carpenters reported to the deputy captain, Lieutenant Baines, that he noticed something resembling land in the distance. Baines replied that it was impossible. According to his data, The shore was more than 200 kilometers away. The lieutenant did not report this to the captain, and the Voyager continued on its previous course. Upon learning of this, Gunnar bulkily decided to check the carpenter's words. He climbed to the lookout platform installed high on one of the masts. The weather conditions were still poor. The ship was constantly shaking, and in the distance, it was hard to see anything except a thick gray mass of fog, rain, and clouds. However, after some time, bulkily discerned land. He saw it quite clearly, and given the weather conditions, this meant only one thing. They were dangerously close to running into rocks and wrecking. Bulkily immediately reported this to Captain Cheap. He ordered an immediate turnaround. The captain personally climbed the masts and helped the sailors manage the sails. In the process, he slipped and fell to the deck from a great height. The impact was so strong that Cheap's shoulder bone popped out from under his armpit. The captain was carried in serious condition to the middle deck, where the operating room was located. The Voyager managed to turn around at the last moment and avoided collision with the land. That same night, the Voyager crew felt a strong jolt. Some thought the ship was hit by a strong wave, but the jolt was from below, and that indicated only one thing. The ship had run aground on a rock. The sailors immediately inspected the hull for breaches, but found no damage. Soon, another impact followed. This time, a large hole formed in the hull, and water began to fill the ship. The ship rocked heavily. Panic began. Even those who had not gotten out of their hammocks for months due to scurvy tried to get to the deck. Others prayed, others ran, trying to do something. The most desperate jumped into the water right away. A small team of experienced sailors, including Bulkeley, tried to maintain calm and somehow control the ship. However, it quickly became clear that their position was hopeless. The ship would go underwater, and quite soon. When it seemed there was no salvation, a barely perceptible ray of hope dawned in the distance. First, the ship was wedged between two rocks, which greatly slowed its descent underwater. Then the clouds began to disperse, and in the distance, something could be made out. There, the Voyager crew saw the outline of an island. On the middle deck, where the operating table was located, water was rising. There, in a semi-conscious state, lay Captain David Cheap. From the sounds of the collision and the ensuing panic, he understood what had happened. The first warship under his command was going underwater. Meanwhile, the sailors, seeing the island in the distance, decided how to swim to it. In theory, the distance allowed reaching it by swimming. However, the strongest waters made this task impossible. Moreover, many sailors could not swim. There was an opinion that such a skill would not save during a wreck in the open sea anyway and would only prolong the suffering. Better to drown immediately. David Cheap ordered the sailors to lower several lifeboats that were on the ship into the water. When no crew members remained on the ship, the captain left the Voyager. After everyone reached the shore, the captain counted the people. 145 people remained, a little more than half of the Voyager's initial complement. Exhausted, sick, in tattered clothes, or partially without any. It created the impression that their ship had wrecked years ago, not hours. The exhausted sailors sat on the empty shore while pouring rain drenched them. Several sailors who still had strength surveyed the area near the shore and found a small wigwam made of branches. So, there were or had recently been people on the island. Inside the hut, they made a place for Captain Cheap and several crew members. All the others remained on the shore without shelter and in remnants of soaked clothes. At night, they tried to sleep as best they could. Few succeeded. Nevertheless, in the morning, the sailors discovered several comrades who, apparently, had fallen asleep so soundly that they barely moved. A little later, it became clear that sleep had nothing to do with it. Their comrades were dead. The Voyager was still wedged by rocks and partially continued to stick out above the water. Cheap ordered boats to be equipped and to retrieve from the ship everything that might be useful on the island. Materials, clothes, and primarily provisions. Despite the fact that the sailors managed to retrieve some flour, jerky, dried beans, and other supplies from the ship, it was obvious that this would not last long. More than 100 people need a lot of food, even if rations are severely limited. Therefore, there was only one way out: to forage for food on the island. To the sailors' disappointment, it quickly became clear that the nameless piece of land in the middle of the ocean was far from paradise. From edible plants, they found only wild celery. In the coastal waters, contrary to expectations, there was no fish. Another option was birds, but they managed to shoot them rarely and no more than a few. The 80-year-old cook boiled something resembling soup from the catch and added flour to make it thicker. In search of food, the Voyager sailors explored the island a bit better. From a small hill, they could clearly see that they were on a relatively small piece of land. The distance between the farthest points was about 5 to 6 kilometers. Several mountains rose from the dense, impenetrable forest that filled almost the entire island space. This is a place where a person's soul dies. A captain of a ship that ended up here would describe the island 100 years later. For the Voyager sailors, this merciless place became home. They understood that given the deplorable state of their boats and the turbulent nature of the waters, attempts to sail away in search of rescue were doomed to failure. David Cheap walked along the shore, leaning on a cane. And although he was still weak, the captain understood that action was necessary. If they wanted to survive, they had to work together. And for that, discipline, order, and a clear hierarchy were needed. Cheap wanted to show that he was still in charge, even if part of the crew blamed him for what happened. By the captain's order, the sailors began building huts. They made frames from branches and sticks, covering the structure on top with sail scraps and clothes. Soon, something like a street with several dozen dwellings on both sides formed on the shore. One of the buildings was allocated for storage. There, they kept all the provisions from the ship, as well as the food they managed to forage on the island. A week after the wreck, a moral uplift was felt among the sailors. There was little food, but it was clearly distributed, and everyone understood what they could count on. The sailors even got bonuses in the form of wine or brandy retrieved from the ship. The main gastronomic masterpiece was seaweed pies. First, the sailors scraped them off the rocks on the shore, then boiled them for a couple of hours, rolled them in flour, and fried them in fat, which in those times was the basis for candles. Many gradually began to recover from scurvy. The sailors did not even suspect that the reason for this was vitamin C, which they got from eating wild celery. Meal times, work, and rest were regulated by the strike of a bell retrieved from the ship. The small village resembled the familiar hierarchy of the Voyager. In some huts lived officers, in others gunners, in thirds carpenters, and so on. A separate dwelling was allocated for the hospital and storage. The nameless piece of land was named after the sunken ship Voyager. At some point, it might seem that Cheap's venture succeeded. On the wild island, a small branch of civilization formed. Captain Cheap, of course, could not know about the starvation experiment of 1945. Then, in the American state of Minnesota, the most detailed study of the effect of hunger on the human body was conducted. In short, the subjects quickly lost a lot of weight, then began to experience serious mental problems. In the end, it came to desires for cannibalism and suicidal thoughts. The most interesting thing in this story is that the participants' daily calorie dose was halved. The shipwrecked Voyager sailors ate less, and their stress level was incomparable. Several weeks after the wreck, all the rocks near the shore were cleaned of seaweed. The ship's provisions were inexorably coming to an end, even despite economizing. And the shot birds were not enough even to feed part of the crew. The fragile picture of civilized existence was collapsing before their eyes. Against the backdrop of hunger, conflicts arose more often. A small group of particularly rowdy sailors organized a dwelling separate from everyone and no longer obeyed the general schedule and rules. One morning, the sailors noticed that someone had stolen part of the flour from the tent with supplies. It didn't take a master of deduction to understand that it was done by one of their own. In the southern hemisphere, winter was beginning. Rain was replaced by snow, and daylight became shorter. One day, the sailors noticed how several boats emerged from the fog densely standing over the water. In sturdy homemade canoes sat several people with dogs. Despite the falling snow, their only clothing was fur capes covering the lower body to the knee. Otherwise, the strangers with dark long hair were completely naked. From the rowers' reaction, it was clear that they did not expect to see anyone on the island. Moreover, they had probably never seen white people before. The sailors realized that the very hut they found upon arrival belonged to the strangers. These were representatives of the Kaaskar tribe. Their ancestors settled in this territory thousands of years ago. Over that time, the Kaaskar learned not just to survive in difficult conditions. They made this place their home. The tribe representatives were sea nomads and rarely spent more than a few days in one place. The Kaaskar knew how to make sturdy boats from tree bark, were not afraid of the cold, well-explored safe sea routes between the numerous islands off the mainland coast, new places where fish and other food sources were. From the point of view of the British fleet sailors, the Khosgar were savages. It was to them, by the king's order, that his subjects brought the benefits of civilization. However, in reality, the picture looked quite different. The Khosgar were at home. They looked healthy, well-fed, and full of strength. The civilized representatives of the kingdom, on the contrary, resembled savages in the most direct sense of the word. The arrived Khosgar were now almost the only hope for rescuing the sailors from hunger. David Cheap greeted the indigenous inhabitants. The two sides poorly understood each other, as everyone spoke unfamiliar languages. The Voyager crew members tried to present gifts to the guests in the form of headgear. The Khosgar showed no interest in the gifts, but apparently realized the dire situation of the sailors on the shore. Several long-haired men jumped into a boat and soon returned with a large catch of fish and unusual spiky balls, inside which was a nutritious orange Massachusetts. These were sea urchins. The tribe representatives masterfully built themselves a shelter from branches and spent the next few days on the island, foraging food for the sailors. Waking up one morning, the crew members found only empty huts. At night, they quietly packed up and sailed away from the island. Perhaps this happened because some sailors tried to harass several Khosgar women. Perhaps they sensed danger, or the sea nomads simply had to move on. In any case, after themselves, they left only a small amount of caught sea gifts, which could last the sailors only a couple of days. In the forest not far from the shore, John Byron found a dog. Apparently, the Khosgar forgot the dog when they hastily left the island. During the day, the animal followed Byron everywhere, and he took the dog to his hut. The dog warmed the sailor with its heat and became his friend. After a few days, several of his colleagues came to Byron's tent. They needed the dog. Byron understood that resistance was useless. That same evening, the sailors ate the dog for dinner. After some time, Byron came for his portion. In conditions of severe hunger, many human qualities receded into the background. Another result of the crew's dire state was complaints against the leadership. Gunner Bulkeley often criticized Cheap in his diary. More and more sailors blamed the captain for what happened to the ship and questioned his current legitimacy. What gave him the right to lead on the island? According to the rules, they must obey the captain on the ship. So, logically, after the wreck, he had no authority. The crew was increasingly sliding into a state of anarchy. Small groups separated, lived on their own, and established their rules. One day, several sailors found the body of a crew member on the island. Not that the death of another sailor was a surprise to anyone, but, according to Midshipman Byron, this time the victim showed signs of strangulation. The devil does not sleep and continuously seeks a new soul for destruction. So it was written in the religious book that Gunner Bulkeley read. He was one of the few who seemed to maintain composure. His hut was always in order. He often brought prey after hunting birds. He also had his own small secret weapons cache taken from the ship. Gradually, other Voyager crew members increasingly came to John Bulkeley's hut for advice and help. He could never become a ship captain due to his origins, but nature cares not about bloodshades. And in the new reality, John Bulkeley looked like an obvious leader. David Cheap understood that he was increasingly losing power and authority among the sailors. His strong side was that the Voyager officers still remained loyal to the captain. In addition, Britain had a fairly strict naval code. According to it, one of the most serious violations for sailors was mutiny. It was punishable by death. Nevertheless, in conditions of hunger and psychological pressure, anything could happen. Cheap needed to show that he was still the legitimate authority, and the occasion did not take long. Two sailors were caught stealing from the provisions hut. One of them turned out to be the one assigned to guard the storage. By Cheap's order, the thieves received 600 lashes each. The punishment was so severe that if executed at once, the sailors would surely not survive. Thus, they received 200 lashes over 3 days. After that, by Cheap's order, the guilty were taken to a small piece of land sticking out of the water not far from Voyager Island. When after a few days Midshipman Byron with several sailors visited the punished comrades, they found that both were already dead. Captain Cheap was sure that the demonstrative sentence would put an end to attempts to steal supplies. Nevertheless, soon they continued. Thieves were caught, flogged, and new ones came in their place. No matter how terrible the punishment, hunger frightened more. In the atmosphere of semi-anarchy, Captain Cheap had a conflict with a sailor named Cousins. He refused to follow the boss's orders and move a heavy barrel of dried beans. It seemed to Cheap that the sailor was drunk. He vehemently denied it. Nevertheless, the captain ordered him to be placed under arrest in the hut that served as the island prison. After a few days after Sailor Cousins was released, he got into a new conflict. In the food queue, he learned that the captain had ordered not to give him his allotted portion of wine. An argument began. At some point, a shot rang out. Captain Cheap was in his tent and was not a witness to the scene, but upon hearing the shot, he immediately ran out. Seeing the situation, he decided that Cousins, who was denied wine, had started shooting. Enraged, Cheap drew his pistol and held it point blank to the sailor's cheek. A few moments later, a shot occurred. Sailor Cousins lay on the ground in a pool of blood. Around stood the Voyager sailors, officers, and Captain Cheap. The atmosphere of confusion was also explained by the fact that the shot Cheap heard from the tent was not fired by Cousins. They shot at him as he was behaving aggressively, but the opponent missed. However, Captain Cheap, due to the previous conflict with the sailor, was sure that it was he who fired the shot. Cheap ordered everyone to disperse. Despite this, almost no one moved. At that moment, many sailors were thinking about their further actions. Before them stood a captain whose competence had already raised many questions. But now he had simply killed a man, in front of everyone, without even figuring out the situation. And there is no doubt that everyone knew the price of disobedience well. It would be a direct path to mutiny. That is, even if they ever returned to England, they would most likely be executed. After a long pause, the crew still dispersed. Cousins was still breathing. He was carried to the hut equipped as a hospital. A gunshot wound is a complex task for an 18th century surgeon, especially if he is on an uninhabited island. No sterilization of instruments or anesthesia, meaning the operation was more likely to finish off the patient than cure him. Nevertheless, Sailor Cousins lasted another 2 weeks. While he was still alive, he asked the doctor to keep the bullet extracted from his jaw as evidence of Captain Cheap's crime. The Voyager sailors buried Cousins. It was the 41st day of stay on the island. Despite hunger, fatigue, and psychological pressure, not all crew members gave up. A few weeks after the shooting incident, one of the carpenters proposed an unexpected idea for rescue. The largest of the boats that were on board the Voyager had not been lowered into the water. It sank with the ship. The carpenter proposed to retrieve it to the island and reconstruct it, turning it into a large ark that would allow the entire crew to reach civilization. Captain Cheap agreed, and work began. Despite the fact that retrieving the boat from the sunken ship seemed a very difficult task, the sailors managed and proceeded to construction. The desperate sailors had a barely perceptible hope for rescue. They planned to saw the boat into 2 parts and build a section in the middle. Thus, almost 4 meters would be added to the initial 11 m of the vessel. This, by calculations, should be enough for all the surviving Voyager sailors. For David Cheap, building the ark became not just a hope for rescue. He intended to rehabilitate himself as a captain. According to his plan, the sailors would reach the Chilean island of Chiloé almost 500 kilometers away. The place was under Spanish control where their trading ships stopped. According to Cheap's calculations, upon arriving at Chiloé, the Voyager crew would capture an enemy ship. On it, they would reach the meeting point with Anson's squadron and triumphantly complete the initial mission. Unlike Captain Cheap, most Voyager sailors had no interest in continuing their mission, which turned out to be doomed to failure from the start. What the sailors really wanted was simply to survive. Gunnar Bulkeley took an active part in building the ark. With a team of like-minded people, they also thought out a rescue plan, and it radically differed from the captain's idea. Bulkeley proposed heading south and reaching the Strait of Magellan. Through it, the sailors could sail to the shores of Brazil. The country maintained neutrality in the British-Spanish War, so there the sailors should safely find a place on a ship to England and return home. This plan had a couple of obvious drawbacks. The Strait of Magellan is a rather dangerous place, very windy, in places very narrow and winding, with a large number of dead ends. All this was the main reason why Anson's squadron initially decided to make the path from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific through the Drake Passage in the south of the continent. Secondly, the path to Brazil from Voyager Island was almost 5,000 kilometers. But, in Bulkeley's opinion, desperate times required desperate measures. At the beginning of August, representatives of the opposition came to Captain Cheap's hut. They handed him a petition. In brief, it described the rescue plan through the Strait of Magellan, but the main thing was the signatures of the sailors who supported the idea. Captain Cheap could no longer just punish all those who disagreed with his orders, because the majority of the Voyager crew was on Bulkeley's side. Cheap was supported only by a small part, mainly consisting of officers. David Cheap said he needed time to think, and the meeting ended there. Almost half a year had passed since the ship's wreck. The ark was finally completed, but the crew still had not come to a final decision regarding the future plan. The situation, meanwhile, was becoming completely critical. According to Midshipman Byron's recollections, some sailors began to engage in cannibalism of deceased comrades. Bulkeley and his accomplices decided to act. The gunner perfectly understood that he had the absolute majority behind him. It was also obvious that David Cheap had committed a crime by killing sailor cousins. And finally, in the opinion of many, Cheap ceased to be captain immediately after the ship's wreck. And on land, he had no leadership rights. Nevertheless, Bulkeley realized that if they were lucky and they still reached Britain, a trial awaited them there. So what happened on the island should resemble mutiny as little as possible and as much as possible a forced measure to remove incompetent leadership. For this, Bulkeley needed to win over one of the senior officers. It was Cheap's first deputy, Lieutenant Baines. After that, the mutineers' team arrested Captain Cheap. The formal reason was the murder of sailor cousins. Initially, Bulkeley planned that they would take Cheap with them on the built boat as a prisoner. However, the captain said to let them rather shoot him than go as a captive. After a week, the majority of Voyager sailors loaded into several boats, the main one being the freshly built ark. On the shore remained only 10 people, 2 of Cheap's supporters and a separate group that had long lived on its own. A little provisions and a small boat were left on the island. David Cheap watched as his former sailors moved further away from the shore. He understood that he was seeing them for the last time. He would never be able to leave the cursed Voyager island. From the departing boat, John Byron looked toward the island. The young midshipman was tormented by doubts. Only now was it obvious that Captain Cheap and several other crew members were left on the island. Before that, Byron thought they would take everyone on the boat. Now everything looked not only like outright mutiny but also effectively murder. For the chances of those left on the island to survive approached zero. That is, if Byron still reached Britain, he could put a cross on dreams of a brilliant naval career. He would most likely face trial and probably be executed. Some other sailors from Bulkeley's team thought about this too. Therefore, when after a couple of kilometers one of the boat's masts broke and they needed to return to the island to get repair materials, Byron and several other members volunteered. In reality, they used this as an excuse to return to Voyager and join Captain Cheap. Thus, the number of people on the island became 20. Returning, Midshipman Byron was saving his naval career and at the same time almost certainly signing his own death sentence. John Bulkeley and the majority of sailors continued their path to the Strait of Magellan. Now they had only 2 boats, one of which was that very ark. There was the absolute majority of people, almost 60 out of 81, as well as almost all provisions, fresh water supply, and weapons. Not surprisingly, there was almost no free space on the ark. Sailors could only be in a sitting position close to each other. They slept sitting, and to go to the toilet, they moved to the edge of the boat. The vessels traversed difficult, raging waters. They moved not far from the shore, which meant constant risk of running into rocks and wrecking. Even a small wave for the small vessels meant that everything inside was flooded with water. The sailors were constantly wet. But the main challenge was that incredibly difficult route had to be overcome by people who were already in an exhausted state after a long stay on the island. A month passed on the way. Several sailors died in the process. Their bodies were simply thrown into the water. The second small boat was carried out to sea during a night storm along with one of the sailors. On the eve, 11 participants in the voyage asked the leader to land them on the first possible shore and leave them there. They simply had no strength to continue. According to Bulkeley's calculations, they had covered about 600 kilometers and were close to entering the Strait of Magellan. Gradually, their food supplies were coming to an end. Bulkeley had to severely cut the already small ration. Of course, this caused indignation from the crew. At that moment, the gunner first felt himself in the same position as Captain Cheap. He was losing authority and the sailors' trust due to unpopular but necessary for survival measures. Despite the fact that the formal leader of the mutineers group was Lieutenant Baines, Cheap's former deputy, everyone understood that the real leader was gunner John Bulkeley. At some point, after another surge of dissatisfaction from the sailors, he had to threaten to go ashore at the nearest shore if they did not stop the disorders. This allowed calming the rebels, as everyone understood that Bulkeley was indispensable for continuing the voyage. After a few more days of travel, the mutineers' leader realized his mistake. He understood that their course was incorrect and for the last few weeks they had been going the wrong route. During that time, they lost strength, some people, and ate most of the provisions. Bulkeley began to think that perhaps Captain Cheap was right. Perhaps rescuing through the Strait of Magellan was a big mistake. Despite all the difficulties, the Voyager sailors under Bulkeley's leadership still reached the strait and by mid-December successfully passed it. They entered the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The voyage was far from over. More than 2,000 kilometers remained to Brazil, and the overwhelming part of the path lay near the shores of Argentina, the territory of which was controlled by the Spanish. That is, at any moment the sailors could be captured. By that time, their food supplies were completely exhausted, not counting a small amount of flour. The crew had no choice but to land on the shore of one of the islands near Argentina to hunt and forage for food. Bulkeley and his team were lucky. They found a piece of land favored by sea lions. The sailors easily caught many animals and immediately began cooking them over a fire and eating. Alas, the Voyager sailors were unaware of the syndrome that many concentration camp prisoners would face in the 20th century. The body experiences severe shock if a large amount of food is consumed after a long period of starvation, which can ultimately lead to death. This is exactly what happened to several sailors from Bulkeley's team. Among the sailors who died on the way to the shores of Brazil was the 80-year-old Voyager cook. He survived scurvy, shipwreck, typhus, and lasted until the end of the voyage less than a week. At the end of January 1742, having covered almost 5,000 kilometers, John Bulkeley and other sailors on the makeshift ark reached the port of Rio Grande in southern Brazil. Local residents looked in amazement at the exhausted sailors. Bodies shriveled to skeletons in scraps of dirty, wet clothes climbed out of the makeshift boat. Many sailors could not move. Out of 81 people who initially set out from the island under John Bulkeley's leadership, only 30 arrived in Brazil. Local authorities, learning that these were members of the missing ship Voyager's crew, provided them all necessary assistance. Bulkeley sent a letter to the British Admiralty representative in Brazil with news of the arrival. Just 2 months after staying in Rio Grande, one of the Voyager sailors boarded a ship heading to the shores of Britain. It was Lieutenant Baines. The reason why Cheap's former deputy was in such a hurry to return home was not homesickness. He was saving his reputation and perhaps his life. Baines wanted to be the first to tell the Admiralty members all the details of the shipwreck and the subsequent vicissitudes of the Voyager sailors. Thus, the lieutenant could shift all responsibility for the mutiny to gunner Bulkeley. For John Bulkeley himself, it took months to find a place on a ship to the shores of Britain. When in January 1743, he disembarked in the port of Portsmouth, he was immediately escorted by soldiers to the Admiralty to give testimony. Thus, Bulkeley learned that Lieutenant Baines had shifted all responsibility for what happened on the island to him. However, the gunner had a big trump card up his sleeve, his journal. There, he detailed day by day everything that happened with the ship and crew. In addition, the journal contained some documents, including the petition to the captain and the paper on his removal from office. Among the signatures under these documents was Lieutenant Baines's autograph. The Admiralty took a pause to consider the case, and during this time, John Bulkeley was forbidden to hire on any ships. For a man who had spent his whole life in the Navy and had a family with children, such an order became a serious problem. Gradually, Bulkeley ran out of money, and the consideration of the case in the Admiralty kept dragging on. In addition, all this time he was in constant tension that he might be found guilty and sent to the gallows. Then the Voyager gunner decided to go all in and publish his voyage records. Ship's logs were relatively popular reading at the time, but their authors were always captains or officers, that is, noble people. Ordinary sailors, including gunners, did not keep records during voyages at all. Not to mention publications. When after half a year Bulkeley's journal was published, it became a scandalous event. Not only was the authorship by an ordinary gunner, But the main shock was the content. Bulkeley told what the Voyager crew went through and how in the process the Royal Navy sailors reached the state of real savages. In addition, the gunner unhesitatingly criticized his superiors in the text, including Captain Cheap, whom he called the main culprit of what happened. The publication of Bulkeley's ship's log became so successful that it was even reprinted. Readers were mostly on the gunner's side, which is not surprising, since the author primarily reflected his vision of events. But despite the success of Bulkeley's diaries, gradually the hype began to fade, especially after, in mid-1744, the ship Centurion returned to England led by Captain Anson. The arrival of the main squadron ship, which had set out on a secret mission almost 4 years before, caused a real sensation. Then everyone learned what the squadron's secret assignment consisted of. After all, in the end, it was successful. It turned out that Centurion lost all the squadron ships during the voyage and remained alone. Nevertheless, Captain Anson intended to capture the Spanish galleon with treasures, even though more than half of his ship's crew had already died from typhus and scurvy. Not far from the shores of the Philippines, they met the coveted galleon and after a tense battle managed to capture it. Inside awaited a big haul. In modern money, the galleon carried treasures worth $80 million. This was the largest sea trophy captured by the British at that time. The treasures were triumphantly paraded through the streets of London. The war with Spain was mostly unsuccessful, so capturing the galleon stuffed with valuables became an important element of propaganda for the British authorities. Against this backdrop, it seemed no one cared anymore about the depressing story of the Voyager sailors. However, 2 years later, an event occurred that again made people talk about the fate of the missing ship. 3 more surviving crew members arrived in Britain. Among them were Midshipman John Byron and Captain David Cheap. Everyone had long considered Captain Cheap dead, including those who left him on the island almost 5 years before. And, of course, everyone was interested in the question of how they rose from the dead. 2 months had passed since the majority of the crew sailed away from Voyager Island on the Ark led by Bulkeley. All this time, the remaining survived on remnants of jerky and boiled seaweed. But despite the hopelessness of the situation, David Cheap was not going to give up. He intended not only to save himself, he still planned to reunite with Captain Anson and capture the Spanish galleon. The sailors patched up the 2 small boats left at their disposal and set off toward the Chilean island of Chiloé. After they covered 150 kilometers, one of their boats sank with several crew members. The second could not withstand everyone in a long voyage, so by Cheap's order, they left 4 Marines on the shore of one of the islands. They, unlike sailors, were useless in sailing, so the choice fell on them. However, the remaining team was not destined to reach Chiloé. On the way, several dangerous capes awaited them. Due to strong waves, Cheap and company could not round one of them. And after several attempts, the desperate sailors turned back. On the way, they stopped at the island where they left the Marines. Nothing remained of them except muskets on the shore. Thus, after 3 months, Cheap and the team returned to Voyager again. Now they had even fewer people, less strength, and no hope at all. Midshipman Byron heard several sailors discussing killing a comrade to eat him. Given the hopeless situation on Voyager Island, there is little doubt that it would eventually come to outright cannibalism. The sailors could be saved only by a miracle, and it happened. Representatives of one of the Patagonia tribes arrived on the island. One of them knew Spanish, as did the Voyager doctor. Thus, the sailors agreed that the tribe representatives would help them reach Chiloé Island. In early March 1742, 13 sailors in a boat and Patagonia residents in canoes began sailing north. During one of the stops, half of the Voyager sailors decided they would move on their own. They stole the boat and sailed away, leaving Cheap, Byron, and several other crew members with nothing. Then the tribe representatives put the British in their canoes and set off to Chiloé Island. Thanks to the fact that the Patagonia residents knew the territory well, their route to the island differed from the one Cheap and the team took during the unsuccessful attempt a month earlier. During the voyage, several Voyager sailors died. In the end, only 4 reached Chiloé Island. Captain Cheap was then in a semi-conscious state and delirious. Only thanks to the help of local village residents did the 4 Voyager sailors, including Cheap, eventually survive. However, their sufferings did not end there. Chiloé was under Spanish control, and soon the British sailors were captured. They were put in a pit, where they spent the subsequent 7 months. After that, they were released but forbidden to leave Chilean territory. Another 2 years later, the other sailors were allowed to return home. The war between Spain and Britain was still ongoing, but no active actions had occurred for a long time. One of the sailors decided to stay with the Spanish, so only 3 set off for home. 5.5 years ago, John Byron and David Cheap were last in England. When the young midshipman arrived in London, his own sister did not recognize him. Emaciated and matured during this time, Byron had changed greatly. David Cheap, upon learning of the publication of Bulkeley's journals, immediately decided to act. His former gunner accused the captain of incompetence, serious mistakes, and murder. Such claims could lead Cheap to the gallows, so he needed to promptly present his own point of view. Instead of publishing his journal in response, Cheap decided to go straight to court. Thus, the story around the fate of the ship Voyager raised a new wave of discussion. Even stronger than a couple of years before, newspapers printed contradictory testimonies of different crew members. The public divided into different camps. After some time, there were so many different points of view on what happened that it was already difficult to separate what actually happened from what was fake. One thing was clear: the trial promised to be loud. Mutiny, murder, cannibalism, and much more. In large part, it was a story about how civilized officers of the Royal Navy descended to the state of savages. John Bulkeley was detained until the court's decision. From one of the lawyers connected to the case, he learned that he would most likely be hanged. According to the harsh naval code, the gunner and his accomplices violated many articles, including committing mutiny and murder when they left the captain and several comrades on the island. For Captain Cheap, the stakes were no less high. For the murder of sailor cousins, he could also face the death penalty. In testimonies, both sides tried to whitewash their reputation as much as possible. For example, Bulkeley claimed that they had no choice but to remove Cheap, and he himself wanted to stay on the island. Cheap, in his testimonies, did not mention the murder of sailor cousins even once. He only claimed that their dispute reached, quote, the extreme point. In mid-April 1746, the court issued a verdict. Its decision surprised many. Turned out incredibly mild. The only guilty party was recognized as Lieutenant Baines. He was charged with not reporting the sighted land to the captain shortly before the Voyager's wreck. As a sentence, Baines received only a reprimand. All the others received no punishment. The court focused exclusively on the causes of the shipwreck. Most likely, this had the following reason. The authorities did not want big publicity. Firstly, everyone would discuss to what low state representatives of civilized society could descend, who were supposed to bring that very civilization to so-called savage tribes around the world. Secondly, the Voyager disaster was another reminder of the generally failed war. Not in the sense that Britain lost important battles. Simply, most of their plans failed. That very ambitious operation of 200 ships ended in nothing but the loss of a large number of ships and sailors' lives due to diseases and storms. Yes, Captain Anson managed to capture the galleon with treasures. The problem was that Britain spent 100 times more on the war than the amount captured. Thus, there is no doubt that it was advantageous for the Admiralty for the Voyager case to simply disappear. The fates of the main participants in the story after the trial varied. Squadron Captain Anson received a quarter of the treasures captured on the galleon and became a very rich man. This did not make him retire immediately. On the contrary, Anson made a dizzying career, won more than one victory, and became a very important member of the Admiralty. He was even called the father of the British Navy. Streets in many cities of the country are named after Anson. Only the appearance of such stars of the British Navy as Cook and Nelson later overshadowed Anson's figure. John Byron, in general, fulfilled his dream of a great naval career. He rose to the rank of vice admiral. Because during his voyages he was constantly pursued by bad weather conditions, he received the nickname Foul-Weather Jack. Byron married and became the father of 6 children. If the surname Byron seems familiar to you, it's not by chance. The Vice Admiral's grandson is the famous Lord Byron, one of the main English poets. 20 years after the Voyager wreck, John Byron published a book where he presented his picture of what happened. Unlike his younger self, he was much more critical of Captain Cheap's figure and actions. Given that the book was written by an experienced Navy officer who knew his business well, most likely this version of events was closer to the truth. Gunner John Bulkeley, 10 years after the trial, decided to escape to where people with a heavy past could start over. He went to America. Little is known about what Bulkeley did in the new country, except that he published his sensational journals there. After some time, Bulkeley simply disappeared, and nothing is known about his fate. David Cheap, despite everything that happened, became a ship captain again. In large part, the support of his former boss Anson helped him. During the trial, he was on his side. David Cheap this time fulfilled all his youthful dreams. He received not only recognition but also money. As captain, Cheap captured several Spanish ships with valuable cargo. As the ship leader, he received most of the captured. David Cheap bought himself an estate in Scotland and finally married. The small island off the coast of Chile today bears the name Voyager. There, one can still come across rare fragments of the ship that wrecked several centuries ago. Otherwise, after 200 years, nothing on the island reminds of the sailors' sufferings or the ambitions of once great empires.